Welcome to Christy Lee Independent Media, getting away from establishment media, and also have an anti-establishment guest on today. He spent 20 years in the Army on 11 combat deployments in special forces. He actually lost his wife, Shannon, who was killed fighting ISIS in Syria. And that is what caused him to step away so that he could take care of their children. And now he is entering the battlefield again, but this time to make a difference by being a member of Congress. Joe, thanks for coming on with me today. Did I get that all right for you?
You did. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much for your service and for your sacrifice and for continuing to care about America and want to get involved in the political level. I think the first question that I want to go ahead and ask is, obviously we've been talking about Afghanistan for several days, and the Biden administration has come under a lot of criticism for how that was handled. So I want to ask you, the other side of that is that President Trump made very clear that he wanted to end the 20-year war, that he was going to withdraw. So what is the difference here? They both wanted to end it. They both wanted to withdraw. Biden has said this was going to be inevitable. Something like this was going to happen no matter who was in charge, he said, after being in a war through 4 presidencies. So what do you have to say about that? What's the difference?
So the big difference is that President Trump wanted to get us out of these endless wars, and he took every step in that direction. He wanted to make that happen. So Trump negotiated a deal from a position of strength with the Taliban that resulted in over a year of no Americans being killed by hostile fire. So he initially tried to get us out last summer, and I want people to remember last summer what happened. There was this big lie pushed by the intelligence community and by the media that there was Russians that were placing bounties on the heads of American soldiers. And therefore, if Trump were to have us withdraw from Afghanistan, it would somehow play into this Russian collusion narrative. It was all made up. It was all a lie. The intelligence community knew it. They went along with it. The media went along with it. And then when Biden comes into office, they just actually admitted that it was all just a game, and that wasn't the case. So our soldiers remained vulnerable, at risk in Afghanistan for well over a year. But nonetheless, Trump, from a position of strength, he did negotiate a deal that would have had us out that summer, but then another deal that would have had us out in May of this year. But Biden, because all he cares about is the political objective, he couldn't give President Trump that win, essentially. If he would have stuck with May, it would have been the vindication of President Trump's peace through strength of America First foreign policy. So he went to the military and he said, hey, will the Afghan military hold until September? Because Biden wanted to have this great victory speech in September 11th saying he ended this 20-year war. The military lied to his face, like they had been lying to commanders for years, like they had been lying to presidents for years, and said, yes, sir, the Afghan military and the Afghan government will hold. They can withstand another 4 to 6 months. They knew that that was a lie. They knew that the second that we stopped supporting the Afghan military, that it would all crumble. But the military-industrial complex, because they have multiple presidencies now of lying to presidents and convincing them to take extensions, they thought that they had gotten Joe Biden to agree to another extension. So what we're seeing right now, it's not just 20 years of lies coming unraveled. It's also these 3 different normally peaceful and cooperating factions of our permanent ruling class, the military-industrial complex, the Democrat political machine, and the media. They're actually clashing. We haven't seen this before. They usually work in perfect lockstep, but right now the military-industrial complex wanted to stay. That's why they didn't plan to leave. You can tell the military did not plan to leave Afghanistan. That's one of the reasons why this withdrawal went so terribly. But Biden, he was derelict in his duties as commander-in-chief, and all he was thinking about was that political objective. So when he said, go ahead and start withdrawing in August, everything fell apart because the military had zero plan whatsoever to ever leave this conflict. And in fact, they even knew that the worse they handled it, the more the Afghan military threw down their weapons and gave them all to the Taliban, the better of a case that the military would have to come back later and start a whole second war. This is exactly what happened in Iraq. We knew when we withdrew from Iraq in 2011 that ISIS or some form of Islamic terrorism was going to take over, and it was eventually going to fail. And when that government collapsed, when ISIS came across the berm from Syria and the Iraqi army that we trained for $2 trillion, $3 trillion and 5,000 dead Americans, threw their weapons on the ground and gave them to ISIS. We got to come back for a whole nother campaign to re-equip the Iraqi army and to go defeat ISIS. And you're seeing the same thing, that you're seeing the same seeds being sown right now by the military-industrial complex.
Can you explain that to those that don't really understand this whole process? What motivation, well, what is the military-industrial complex for those that don't really understand what that is? And what is the motivation for continuing wars and going into more war?
Yeah, so the military-industrial complex, is really the senior level leaders of our military who want wars to continue on pretty much indefinitely. They want to be able to apply the trades, the tools of the military against pretty much every single problem set. This gives them the ability to advance in the ranks. This gives them the ability to justify bigger and bigger budgets. Everybody in the U.S. government wants a bigger and bigger budget. The Pentagon is no different. The Pentagon already gets a massive amount of money, but they always want more. But it's also fueled by special interests and these defense contractors. So defense contractors want to be able to sell not just the Pentagon large amounts of munitions, large amounts of tanks, vehicles, et cetera. They want to be able to sell it to foreign governments. The best way to get that machinery over to foreign governments is to have some sort of a training, advisory, or nation building package going to support that government, to them standing up their own military that looks just like our military. This is what we've done in Iraq, this is what we've done in Afghanistan. We buy them all this U.S. gear. We're buying it from U.S. defense contractors who are in turn hiring all the retired generals, some of the retired colonels to go work in their ranks. So there's this massive financial incentive to keep these wars going on. Something that people overlook a lot too is the think tanks that fuel the ideology behind regime change. You used to hear George Bush talk about this all the time, how we need to go topple these regimes. We need to go ensure we need to go ensure that civics are being taught. We need to ensure that little girls are going to school. There's an ideological backbone to this in the think tank culture. On the left, you see this responsibility to protect doctrine that basically says that anywhere there's any kind of atrocity or human rights violation or crimes against women or minorities, there's a need for U.S. military intervention. There's different nuances in the doctrine and the ideology, but the end result is always the same. The military defense contractors get to deploy massive amounts of troops and get to spend massive amounts of money, and the people at the top get very, very rich off these wars. So that's what the military-industrial complex really is.
You raise a good point about just the anger that this builds up and watching this all play out, and especially the pointing of the fingers at senior leadership. I'm sure you've seen the video from Lieutenant Stuart Scheller.
Yes.
And he was that Marine relieved for duty for voicing it and putting it up there and calling them out. Now he's doubled down and resigned, to my understanding, surrendering much of his benefits that he would have. I wanted to get your feedback on what you thought of his video and what he had to say.
You know, his first video where he really lays out, hey, there was massive mistakes made that resulted in those 11 Marines, 1 soldier, and 1 sailor, 13 great Americans, and many other that are wounded in action. And they're not out of the woods yet. They're being worked on in Germany and Walter Reed. So mass casualty event, a horrible loss of life. He pointed out accurately that could have been prevented. But the reason why that those Americans were pushed out into the crowd that way and made very vulnerable was the top-down pressure coming from our leaders, and that catastrophic incident wasn't just due to, oh, well, this is a war and sometimes people get killed. It wasn't due to that. It wasn't due to the fog of war, the friction of war. It was due to poor leadership. He is the only leader. He's the only commissioned officer in the United States military that had the courage to say that and to say it publicly. I hope that there's others that are just not saying this publicly. But right now, the machinery of the Pentagon is so deaf to any kind of criticism from within that I don't think anyone could work within the system. I think they had to do what Colonel Scheller did. And so I really commend him for speaking out. And then he said, I'm going to risk it all. And he tendered his resignation just a day later. Of course, between the time that he made the video and then he actually tendered his resignation, he was relieved of his command. He was taken out of a position of leadership. And I just think that's absolutely ridiculous. So really, when you look at it, the only person that spoke out is Colonel Scheller. And also the only person who is removed from command is Colonel Scheller. No one else has taken responsibility and no one else has been held accountable.
Now, you do mention that he was the only one to speak out publicly, but right on the heels of the pullout, I was guest hosting another show, took calls, and it was all veterans, all military members. some of them choked up, just so heartbroken. I can't imagine the trauma that this might have caused you, just having lost your wife in 2019 and then having to see this all play out. Got to imagine that created some trauma or heartache all over again. And then you also had those calling in that were just enraged, so angry at how this played out. And so I want to ask you about the morality, how the military is feeling. The morale is what I mean, because you have that, you have the withdrawal, you have General Milley more concerned with being woke and pushing critical race theory, and then you have this crazy hardcore push of mandated vaccines on the military. It almost is like, is there some underlying reason to lower morale in the military right now? Is that too extreme to think, or what do you perceive as the military's morale?
Well, right now the morale is very low for everything that you just pointed out, but this is being done deliberately. From the time that Biden came into office and he appointed Secretary of Defense Austin, and Austin in his confirmation hearings, he said, hey, his biggest concern right now was extremists, conservative extremists, white nationalists, whatever he wanted to call them, within the ranks of the military. And from there, he did some really critical things. He said they were going to start going through basically the social media profiles of people to see if they had ever flown a Gadsden flag, if they had a MAGA hat, if they supported the last duly elected president, to flag them as potential extremists. They added a different question onto the security clearance process. And the security clearance process is critical because you really can't advance in rank or get a good job in the military without a security clearance. So it's a huge gate to clear. And they added this whole stipulation in there that says, have you ever been part of an extremist group? And the adjudicators in the security clearance process, they have a good deal of discretion. So with the culture coming from the top that there's one segment of the population, a certain political view that we're just going to consider extreme, that gave those adjudicators the ability to pretty much label anybody that they deemed as a member of an extremist group. And that was putting a lot of stress on the troops. It takes a lot of time to go through people's background to see what their political ideology is. But if you can give them a point-blank test of, hey, take this, and if you don't take it, then I know that you're not one of us and I can kick you out. That I see the vaccine as being a tool for them to do that, to fully purge their ranks. And the purging of the military, this institution that has the ability to apply force, purging those of folks that dissent from the current regime, that is a textbook Marxist, that is a textbook totalitarian play out of their playbook. So that's what I see going on right now. But there's no reason why that should be a mandate right now. It should be the individual's choice. I mean, I hate even talking about COVID science because they've just been so dishonest with the COVID science. But as far as fit young populations go, COVID is almost a non-issue. So people that are in the military are by and large young and fit. They're supposed to be young and fit anyways.
And they won't even test them to see if they've already had COVID and have the antibodies. They just want to have this one size fits all approach, and not to mention that the fully approved batch, that fully approved label isn't even out. So we still have only the emergency use authorization out. But that's getting into the weeds. We can move on from there. I wanted to ask, Biden says that he wants to focus, that part of his reason for the withdrawal was to focus on greater threats like China because of competition with China. But now you have the Chinese government developing or saying that they're developing diplomatic relations with the Taliban. So how does that play into all of this mess?
So, I mean, Biden's national security team is at best very sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party. At worst, a lot of them are probably compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Secretary Blinken, Sullivan, the national security advisor, and then a lot of the deputies too. When they're out of government, they've been working for these Chinese-funded think tanks. They've had positions at universities that are funded by the Confucius Institutes. And these guys are, by and large, their ideology is they're globalists. They believe there's nothing exceptional about America. They believe that America is just one of these other nations in the world that should be on good terms with every nation. These are the same guys that gave us the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, because they thought, hey, we should just be giving all kinds of carrots with no sticks to Iran. That's the mentality here. But if you look at the value that Afghanistan has with its rare earth minerals, in particular zinc, in particular with a lot of the minerals that are part and parcel to building the batteries for a lot of the rechargeable electric things like electrical cars, those charging stations. A lot of that's going to come from Afghanistan. The Chinese Communist Party has been working for years behind the scene to make deals with the Taliban, to make deals with the old Afghan government, but to make sure that they can extract those. If you tie the U.S. withdrawal with the amount of rare earth minerals that are there in Afghanistan, with the infrastructure bill that has all kinds of money that goes to redoing the infrastructure of America to make us more electric car friendly, that's going to result in a huge demand for these batteries and these charging stations for electric cars to be put on the U.S. So we're going to be in the market for that. Right now, the only game in town is China. So the infrastructure bill is essentially on its first pass, somewhere between 300 billion and 330 billion to go build this advanced electrical architecture. If you tie that up with how quickly we're trying to get out of Afghanistan to let China have more breathing space, and the fact that we didn't cut any kind of deal to get those rare earth minerals out, or even work on getting our own ability to mine our own rare earth minerals here in America, tie that to the infrastructure bill, tie the Chinese Communist Party ties to to our elites, especially to our elites within Biden's national security establishment. It just paints a very clear picture that it's America last every single time. And these elites, like Joe Biden has said time and time again, they see China as the ascending power and they see us as the descending power. And they think there's nothing wrong with that. And so therefore they won't fight for it.
Now, you say that this all started at 18. You volunteered to be a part of the Army and to put your boots on the ground, actually fight for this country in combat. And now you're saying that you're stepping up and volunteering to fight for us in a different manner in Congress. And I wanted to get your perspective on how important is it for those that are in Congress to have an understanding of what real life combat is like, to have an understanding of the inner workings of our defense, our military. How important is that, and what will you bring to the table?
I think it's absolutely critical for Congress. I'm not saying that every congressman has to be a veteran or served in the military, but I think it does give us a big advantage because one of Congress's constitutional duties is to declare war and is to oversee the military, oversee the budget for the Department of Defense and for a lot of our national defense. That's right inked into Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So having that perspective really gives you a broader understanding of what the Department of Defense actually does. So when these massive budgets come through, you have a lot more knowledge looking at it. When these generals come before Congress to say they need a bunch of money or they need a new war, you can actually skeptically ask them, what's this for? Why do you need the new war? I think it also gives us the perspective, especially most of the veterans right now that are veterans of the global war on terror. We lost friends. I lost my late wife in combat. We know the true cost of war. So it's not an abstract concept. It's not something that's clean. It's not something that is not going to have any ramifications because it doesn't affect the vast majority of Americans. Veterans have a completely different perspective when a new war or an extension of a war is being proposed. I mean, I think Congress has been absolutely out to lunch since 9/11 on their congressional duties. They basically gave an authorization to use force in 2001, and they've really just let whatever president is in charge run amok with these wars, and they've just authorized the budget every single year, and the budget's gotten bigger and bigger. And there's a couple exceptions here and there, asking really hard questions. I mean, so for me, it's absolutely critical that we enter endless wars. We end this nation building. We never do nation building again. We never do regime change again. If I'm going to authorize the use of military force as a congressman, I want to know what the distinct national security threat is, how we're going to neutralize it, and then how we're going to get out of that conflict. Short of those three criteria, I would not authorize a new war. And then same thing with these massive expanding budgets. I mean, the budgets are power. And I think the military, we need to have a robust, strong military. There's no doubt about that. Robust, strong intelligence agencies. But there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of grift that's come along with this creep of nation building. There's a whole, I'd say, cottage industry, but it's more like a Manhattan condo industry that's been built off of these wars. So I look forward to bringing that to Congress, some accountability and some transparency.
And it sounds like that's certainly needed, and it sounds like that's also going to be needed to be checks and balances, because all signs are pointing to that they want to put us into more war. Well, how can we support you and find you and learn more?
Yeah, please go to joekentforcongress.com. I got all my stances, the issues on there. All my media hits are on there, links to social media. And if people can, I'd really appreciate a donation. I'm going after one of the Trump impeachment voters who's been an absolutely terrible Republican for a very long time, voted to stop construction of the border wall, stopped us from using force against Antifa as they burned our cities down, voted for Obamacare. The list goes on. Going after her, but she's being supported by the Republican establishment, by Kevin McCarthy, and by the corporate donor class of the GOP. So I'm up against that, and then I'm also up against the far left. So joekentforcongress.com. If people could help us out with a donation, I'd really appreciate it.
David and Goliath situation, but we know how that story ends. Thank you so much for coming on today, Joe Kent. And we'll be putting this up on my website. If you're watching it on a different platform, you can go to my website, which is now Christy Lee Independent Media. That's KLIM.news, and check it out. And we'll put the links there as well, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.